In today's video, audaciously enough, I'm going to attempt to answer a question from you, and it's on one of the most pathologically misunderstood topics in all of ghetto automotive engineering. The deep dive into wheel nuts and what you need to know about tightening them up and undoing them is next. I'm John Cadogan from AutoExpert.com.au. New cars cheap, but Australia only. Website. Card. Today's question comes from an dude whom I will call Jez. Jezza. That's a good Australian name, is it not? Now, a couple of things. This is, like most of the emails I receive, totally unsolicited. And I never ask people to write in with their burning automotive questions because I don't have a void in my life that needs filling in this way. You are not the spack filler, and I am certainly not the crack for you. Dude. So if you write to me in this way, do not be surprised if the answer appears in a video, and do not be further surprised, humiliated, outraged, whatever, if I read your missive in a stupid voice. The better to pay homage to the Australian psyche that runs deep in all of our veins. And also, it's kind of the median person who used to ring me up when I worked on radio, especially midnight to dawn, talking to the crazies for 6 hours. Who wouldn't want to do that? Anywho, Jezza goes. I would be interested to hear your thoughts about tyre fitters' use of rattle guns and bat's piss on wheel studs. Never actually seen anyone use, organic bat's piss on wheel studs, but I suppose he means anti-seize. Who would know? I always reset my nuts when I get home. Yeah, I think we all do. Dude, because it's so undignified doing so on the bus, is it not? I always reset my nuts when I get home with a wheel brace. Now, there is a point of difference, however. So all adjusting even, fucking tight. So at least me wife might have a chance of undoing if needed. Brackets, rural life. Then also clean gunk off studs first chance I get. Cheers, Jezza. Well, Jezza, I'd like to thank you for being such a proponent up front of equality. I think that's something society certainly needs more of, is women doing these kinds of jobs. They begged for it for years and years and years, and here you are delivering finally. Not being part of the oppressive patriarchy, dude, so well done there. But it is insidious and rife, this sexism in Australian society. For example, the dudes who recently fitted my solar array to the roof were all dudes, disappointingly, and they got to enjoy the burning sunlight for hours on end, parked on the northern aspect of the roof. They got to experience the thrill of the danger of potentially falling to their death if they got something wrong. And why should they have that to themselves? Why should they have all the fun? I'll give you another example. Recently, a few months ago, the dog runs up the backyard and buries its snout in an area not usually that interesting to the dog, so I walk over and have a little look, and entertainingly enough, like to the point of abject hilarity, the sewer was overflowing. So I ring Sydney Water and I say, hey, the sewer's overflowing. And they go, I'm talking to a lovely lady, I assume a lady, but who would know in 2021? Anyway, someone who sounded like a lovely lady, and she says, where's the nearest access port? And I go, like, being an engineer is a superpower at times, but it's obviously limiting in some situations, because all of a sudden she says access port, I go into the matrix and I pull out the schematic for a sewage system, and I look for the label access port, and I'm drawing in complete blank, right? And I say, access port, what do you mean? And she says, well, the access port. And I think, well, that's unhelpful, but I pull up another schematic from the matrix, and no access port. And I'm having to think I'm in a runtime error, And I say, do you mean manhole? And there's silence, right? And she says, no, I mean access port. But are we really talking about a manhole? And she said, sir, we no longer use that term. And I'm thinking, right, manhole. This is the front line of the battle for equality at Sydney Water, right? And we're going to call it an access port now so that all of the little girls in primary school who deeply desire a career in the sewage unblocking industry no longer feel oppressed by the patriarchy. And then I note that the two blue singlet dudes they ultimately sent out to do the job, they were both dudes. They got to deep dive into the problem and thus prevented a woman who would be equally good at it from enjoying the fulfilling result of unblocking the sewage system for a member of ambient society. So, Jezza, allow me to congratulate you for putting your wife in a position where she feels entitled to change a flat tire. Approved. Dude. Now, let's talk about this. The first thing is, I guess, that the wheel nuts on your car are designed to operate or the studs are designed to operate in tension so that they're a clamp that pulls the wheel onto the mounting face. And this is a high tensile bolted joint. Now, if you're a dude who works on cars in a garage and didn't bother going to engineering school because you were afraid of how often you'd bleed through the ears, I approve because this bleeding process was not fun, but you're probably a little bit hazy about bolted joint, like high tensile bolted joint design, because many of the other bolted joints you might deal with, for example, wooden posts going into stirrups and being held in place by through bolts, they're not high tensile. They're just in shear. They do their thing in shear, you know. The fact that the nut is on the end just stops the bolt falling out, whereas the fact that the nut is on the end of the stud is absolutely critical to the performance of the joint when it comes to wheels going on the mounting flanges of axles, whatever. And it's really critical to get that right because they're not meant to operate in shear, they're meant to operate in tension as clamps, all right? And the first thing I'd point out about all of this is there's advice in the operating manual, like the owner's manual, about how to do this, what's the torque, and lubrication or not. And I don't agree with all of it, but if you don't know anything about this, you won't go wrong if you follow the manufacturer's instructions. So you can't go wrong by having no additional lubricant on the studs. The first thing that people don't understand about this is that the so-called dry assembly of high tensile bolted joints actually means in the condition that the fasteners come out of the factory, which is lightly oiled, because that's how they roll. They don't come out dry. So washing them in acetone or something is not going to be helpful. And the other thing is that you can lubricate the studs, but if you do that, you have to know more about how high tensile joints work than just some mug punter who owns a car and really doesn't hold a spanner that often and doesn't think about engineering stuff that often. So we'll get into that, all right? There's a correction factor for lubrication in high tensile bolted joint design. I'll get to that in a minute too, but the first thing you need to realise is that these components, wheel studs, the nuts, the wheels, whatever, they're very robustly designed, meaning there's a lot of meat between the Goldilocks tension in the studs and the failure of the studs by, breaking due to excessive tension, like overcranking it, okay? They're not going to yield and then break, because there's so much fat between the assembly torque specification and the failure of the component. And this is exactly what good design looks like. Your average wheel stud in a car is like M12 by 1.5. The M12 bolt that you buy from Bunnings is probably M12 by 1.75, most likely. So the wheel stud in a car is a fine thread. It's like a metric fine, whereas the bolts on the shelf at Bunnings are going to be metric coarse. Okay, and that makes a little bit of difference to the cross-sectional area and also the tension that derives from the torque that's applied. But when you use a torque wrench, even if you try really hard, it's only approximate. Okay, there's a lot of error, and most of that is due to overcoming the friction between the mounting faces of the thread and the mounting face of the nut. So anywhere where the female thread touches the male thread on the way in and the mounting face of the nut touches the wheel, you lose a lot to friction, and that's highly variable. So tightening up even with a torque wrench is approximate. However, it's better than just doing it by hand. By hand at the roadside for emergency repairs fitting the spare tyre, totally fine. Just get home and then use a torque wrench. And by the same token, when you get your tyres changed out of tyre fitters and they use a rattle gun inevitably to just tighten things back up quickly, then they're not going to damage the studs, most probably, all right? But you might not be able to undo them at the roadside. The test for if a stud is damaged is if you get a wheel off the car and you can run the nut up the whole way and back, it's not damaged, because a small amount of permanent stretch in the stud would indicate that it's yielded and you won't be able to get the nut all the way up. Okay, and then you should throw the stud away. You should just punch it out and replace it, or get a mechanic to do that for you. But the studs are undamaged if the nut runs all the way up and back, so you are good to go indefinitely. There's no life to these things provided you don't overcrank them and yield them. So if you decide to use lubricant, then the standard correction factor, and I'm not pulling this out of my arse, I'm getting it from the Ajax fastener handbook, so might as well go to the horse's mouth and listen to what the manufacturer of threaded fasteners says about threaded fasteners. They say, A, that the dry assembly torque specification for fasteners is actually lightly oiled, because that's how the fasteners roll off the production line. And if you want to heavily lubricate them, the correction factor for the torque is 0.7. Now, I'm not telling you to do this, but I am telling you that this is what I do with all of my cars. I take their handbook and I look at the torque specification for the wheel nuts, and I take 30% off. Like, I multiply that torque by 0.7. And that's what I do them up with after I've applied a bit of anti-seize. And the reason I do this is because we're going to get the same clamping force out of the fastener at less torque. It's easier to undo at the roadside, never corrodes up. So even if it's 12 months since the wheels have been off the car and you get that flat tyre, or for the sake of equality, or lovely wife does, and she reaches for the tools in the car, it's going to be easier to undo the fastener, and corrosion's not going to be a problem. Now, I use the copper stuff. It doesn't matter what the additive is, but it's just this basically copper-coloured grease, okay? There's nothing particularly NASA or aerospace about any of this, right? It's just something that is long-lasting and prevents components from seizing up. And I always take that 30% off the torque. Now, Ajax says, as a ballpark, that the recommended assembly torque for an M12 fastener, grade 10.9, which approximates the stud in a car, is 109 Newton meters. So let's call it 110. 70% of that is 77. And I know that these fasteners are quite robust, so I would set my torque range to 80 if the recommended assembly torque was 110. And the acid test for this is, do the fasteners come loose, right? And if they don't, you're in the sweet spot, dude. Now, it's not as if there's failure without warning either in systems such as this. So I was driving along in some test car. We'd been doing some test for Wheels magazine out at Eastern Creek Raceway on the skid pan. And I was driving some, I think it was a WRX. I was driving it home, which is a distance of, 20-something kilometres. I'm on the freeway, and as I'm powering, like when I'm feeding positive throttle into the powertrain, she's all good. When I lift off, there's a little rattle and it starts getting worse, but only when I lift off. And it seems to be at wheel frequency, right? And I'm going, got to be loose wheel nuts. So I get out and I check them and they're less than finger tight. So guaranteed, the wheels have come off and on a few times, might have been a tyre test or something. And the fitter of the wheels has neglected to rattle gun up the one wheel on that car, and it's coming loose over time. But there's plenty of time. Like if you notice something like this and you drive along for 30 minutes, you're a freaking peanut. But if you notice it and you pull over somewhere safe and you just do a little test and you get out the standard toolkit that comes with the car and you tighten up those nuts and then you whip out a torque wrench when you get home and make sure they're right, then all good. So it's not like you get catastrophic failure without warning if the wheel nuts come loose. If you want to try the 80 Newton metre trick or whatever it is, then my advice would be do that, go for a drive, come back and just leave the torque wrench set up at the same setting and go around those studs again and see if any of them are loose. And then give it a couple of days, do the same thing. And if none of them are loose on both of those occasions, give it a week and just repeat. And if it's all good, give it a month and then don't worry about it because it's working, okay? I'm not telling you to do this. I'm saying that's what I do. And it has never come literally unglued for me. Now, the way the torque specification works on wheel nuts, okay? You're typically clamping an alloy wheel to a steel flange on an axle, right? The aluminium is quote unquote weaker than the steel of the nut and the flange. And there is a potential risk that if you overcrank the nut, you're going to compress beyond the point of yield the aluminium mounting face on the wheel. That's kind of bad. Okay, so you don't want to do that, and that might be the limitation. But the other thing is, if it's just, for example, steel on steel, the limitation might be that you just want to be in the sweet spot for the elongation of the stud, which corresponds to a particular clamping force. And if you want to put this in perspective, when you do an M12 fastener up to the recommended clamping force, which is clamping torque, which is modelled to deliver about 65% of the yield stress of the stud, then you're in the sweet spot. You're a long way away from failure. Okay, so 65% of yield is, and the yield stress is a significant way away from failure still, although it's the point at which the fastener is ruined, right, for ongoing repeated use. So just to put this in perspective, if you're using a class 10.9 fastener, the ultimate tensile strength is 1040 megapascals. Don't worry what megapascals are. Just look at it like, we'll put a scale up and we'll call that 100. The yield stress is 940, so we'll call that 90, okay? And the proof load, which is another specification, is like 830, so we'll call that 80. So the torque that you tighten it up to is about 2/3 of the yield stress. So if the yield stress is at 90 and runaway failure is at 100, then the torque that you're doing it up to is about 60 on the scale, all right? And to put that in perspective, an M12 fastener is going to break at 87 kilonewtons. That's about 9 tonnes. The proof load's going to be about 70 kilonewtons, which is about 7 tonnes, and the assembly torque is going to be 45 kilonewtons, which is about 4.5 tonnes, okay? So breaking at about 90, doing it up to about 4.5. There's a big margin of safety when you think in terms of proximity to failure. And that's why you don't have to use anything more advanced than a torque wrench to get this right. You don't have to use torque to yield bolts, like where you torque them to a pre-assembly torque and then move them through a certain amount of angle to get the stretch. You don't have to use strain gauges or measure the elongation of the stud directly, or use the load indicating washers, which are also more precise than torque wrenches. Those other two are the strain gauges and the elongation measurement. That's much more aerospace laboratory kind of stuff, right? You only need the most rudimentary torque wrench to get this right, in other words, okay? Lubrication is fine as long as you make adjustments to high tensile joints generally, not telling you to do it. And I guess the other thing to remember here is that you need to come up with a strategy for what happens in a worst case scenario at the roadside if something definitely goes wrong, okay? And you need to pull the wheel off and it's hard work. So I would suggest that the toolkit, the standard toolkit, meaning the jack, the wheel brace, they come with a car, they're beyond shit and they're always engineered down to the absolute minimum requirement. And in other words, you're a mug if you don't upgrade them. So in terms of upgrading the wrench that comes with the car, I would upgrade to something like this. Now, you don't have to buy a real expensive one, but you have to buy one that's going to be robust enough that you can depend on it when the chips are down. And my two go-to brands here for tools of this nature, and my shop is full of tools from both of these brands. This one is from Force, but Renegade Industrial do a pretty good line in tools of this nature as well. They both come from a business called Trade Tools, which you can look up online. It's just tradetools.com.au. They're based in Queensland, ship nationally. The quality is very high and the prices are very good. So this one's $350, but I would suggest to put a 500 or 600 millimeter wrench breaker bar in the car. I'd also carry a 100 millimeter extension just in case you've got quite a way to go in there beyond the exterior rim of the wheel. And you know how most wrenches that come with cars are permanently fixed at an angle like that to overcome that concavity of the wheel? It's much nicer to use something such as that, okay? And the next thing I do is I just get a deep impact socket like this, okay? Make sure it's the right size before you drive off into the sunset thinking you've solved this problem. Just make sure that the wall thickness of the socket goes inside the counterbore on the wheels, like the hole that is bored in the wheels to accept the hex of the nut. Because if the socket's too big at the to go into that counterbore, because you bought a big fat socket for Christ knows what reason, it's bad to find that out when you need to use the socket in the middle of the night at the roadside. I mean, the swear jar will be full, right? So I'd get all of those things, and then even your lovely wife, who might weigh, I don't know, 60 kilos. 60 kilos is about 600 kilonewtons, 600 newtons, sorry. So if she's on the end of a 0.6 bar, which probably means being 0.5 away from the pivot, so that's going to be 300 newton meters of static torque, which should be enough to undo most wheel nuts, especially if you've only done them up to 80, because they're lubricated. I'm not telling you to do it. But if she gives it a bit of a, like this, bit of an inertial sort of push as well, she'll probably get 400, 450 newton meters out of that. So that would be enough to overcome the majority of assembly sins by the tyre fitter, right? The other strategy here, and this was taught to me by a really old fitter in a big factory in the section that pulled apart railway bogies, these giant bits of cast iron that sit underneath locomotives, and they contain like 3 big 1500 volt traction motors. And all this section did was pull these bogies apart, and then recommission them, reassemble them with new bits. It was fascinating. It was like Curtis from Cutting Edge Engineering, the work that he does, right? You should visit his channel. It's awesome. He's even got Hollywood teeth now, so he looks the business. But he does amazing work, right? Like really amazing work. It was like that every day for 6 months, you know, and this poor old bastard had the job of shepherding around various, you know, young cadet engineers who knew jack shit about this and that. And one of the fascinating things he taught me was that it's better to hit a wrench with a hammer than it is to push on it really hard if you've got a fastener that is reluctant to undo. So in other words, you get your breaker bar and you get Dead blow hammers work really well. They're not that expensive. They're very durable. They're a great tool. They don't bounce back at you, right? Because they're full of steel shot, and this helps contain the rebound and deliver more of the energy into the impact. The other thing you might choose to use, and this is one of the things I acquired very shortly after this lifelong lesson that I was given by that old fitter, was a brass hammer, right? And the beauty of a brass hammer is that you can hit your tools with it, and if they're good quality tools, you don't destroy the tools. It's just that the faces of the hammer get to where the slings and arrows of your repeated assaults on whatever, you know. And that's why I really like this hammer. I love picking it up because I've had it for like 30 years, and the shape of it now is evidence of what it's been used for and what I've achieved with it. So that's great. But you could carry either of those two things with the car, and if the fastener's really reluctant, you are less likely to shear it off by hitting it with a hammer than you are by getting you, your beer gut, and your corpulent freaking ass on top of the wrench. Much better to give it the shock than the slow, gentle pull, all right? So that's about all I've got for you on this. I hope it's lifted the lid on how, you know, some of these things are engineered. There's a lot of engineering in the background, keeping those rims on those flanges with those studs and those nuts. When you think about it, the assembly torque of an M12 fastener is going to generate about 4.5 tons of clamping force, which is 2 Hiluxes per stud. So that's more than 20, it's like 25 or something tons of clamping force just keeping the wheel on that flange, right? To me, that's amazing because you don't need that much manual effort to achieve 4.5 tons times 5, and yet the result of that limited effort, you're pushing that nut up the ramp of the helix, and the amount of load that can deliver is still amazing to me. The other thing I'd suggest you do if you're pulling the wheels off the car is the wheels typically mount on a round boss. A boss is a thing like that just sticks out of the mounting flange, right? So it's just a round thing that is a mating surface, like a reference surface that the wheel goes onto. And quite often when you've got an aluminium wheel in contact with a steel boss like that, there's a lot of corrosion that can take place at that point thanks to the two dissimilar metals. The aluminium tends to sacrifice itself cathodically, right? Or anodically, whatever. But cathodically protect itself. Cathodically protect the steel. Get it right. So it's a good idea, I feel, to smear a small amount of anti-seize compound around the locating boss as well and the corresponding surface on the wheel. And that will, A, do something towards separating them electrically, like electrochemically insulate the two bits, but it'll also make it just easier to get the wheel off the car, because sometimes that corrosion between the boss and the mounting recess counterbore on the wheel is enough to prevent you from just slipping the wheel off. And the last thing you want when you're on the shittiest jack on earth, on the shittiest surface at the roadside, is to be levering it really hard, because if you're doing that, you're likely to pull the car off the jack, and that's going to be all kinds of disaster, especially if your legs are under it, which they should never be. And this is why in the car I would prefer the mighty dead blow hammer, because if you're helping someone who is stuck in this way, wheel up in the air, can't get it off, guaranteed it's that corrosion that's stopping the wheel from coming off the car. If you've got your mighty dead blow hammer, you can just give it a bit of a tap on the underside at the bottom, which is also less likely to yank it off the jack than giving it, 100 front row forwards worth of tensile pulling like this, right? So just hit it. Hitting something judiciously is one of the best things you can learn in the workshop, and it is full actually of mechanical sympathy. There's a lot of ways to hit something right and a lot of ways to hit something wrong, and it's very important to know the distinction. And the other thing I'd suggest is, if you want to pick up some more nuance here, just search for Ajax fastener handbook, Ajax. It's a PDF, downloaded online. It's full of cool shit about how bolted joints actually work. So with that, my work here is done. I hope this helps. I hope that helped you, Jezza. I'd like to say thanks for your question, but I never thank anyone for their question because I didn't friggin' ask for it. So hopefully it gets you out of trouble. Dude.